Well, first, this book was inspired by my own experiences. I was a refugee as a child. My family fled Iran and we came to America. So, and ever since I was a kid, I was obsessed with this idea of how do I be believed, and who is more credible, than the next person. How do we decide who do we believe and who we don't believe? And I was also obsessed with questions of faith. I mean, we were converts to Christianity, and that's why we had been given asylum in the U.S. And of course, our performance of our faith was so different from other people around us, and all of those things just really kind of fed my curiosity. And so from those early years, I drew my memories and the things that I'd been taught about faith and believability, the things I'd read, like the Bible, stories by Kafka, and some of the people that some of the writers, I guess, that I've been thinking about my entire life. And then the second portion of the book is kind of looks at vulnerable people now, and privileged people, and how their stories are heard. And so for those, I did a lot of reporting. I used first of all, I went to a lot of charities like Freedom from Torture, the Helen Bamber Foundation, Medical Justice. These are in the UK. And in the US, I went to the Innocence Project, and I talked to lawyers and activists and doctors about believability. And I read this wonderful report by Freedom from Torture called Beyond Belief, about how asylum interviews are conducted and what asylum seekers go through when trying to tell their story. And then I did lots of anonymous interviews, again, with lawyers and their clients, and then with people like, a former Home Office presenting officer. And I read things like, the asylum laws and the Refugee Convention, and all of those things that determine, I guess, how we listen to stories of outsiders. And then lastly, I did a lot of reflecting in this book. And so for that, I went to writers that I admire and who affect my thinking. I read Primo Levi. Again, I read Simone Weil. I read Susan Sontag, Elaine Scarry, and people who grappled with these questions of how do we put ourselves in another person's shoes? How do we believe and listen to survivors? How do we require others to perform their pain? And whether can we can we see someone manifesting their pain and truly believe it or feel it in our own bodies? So it was kind of a combination of reporting, interviewing, reading, reflecting, thinking, and remembering. Well, I think that when we listen to other people's stories, we're not necessarily looking for, evidence of the truth. I think we're more looking for something familiar to relate to. And I think this is not just our own experiences in our life, but also the kinds of stories that we've heard and that we've been taught are believable stories, or the kind of heroes and villains that we, believe as heroes or villains. And that is so completely cultural. Ever since, starting with when we're little kids, little babies, we hear stories, we hear narratives that they've been crafted for us according to the rules of that particular culture. And I think that plays a huge role in deciding whose performance of their joy or pain, or their tragedies or traumas we find truthful or believable, because we've seen thousands of those performances in the past in stories. So a good example of this is when I was doing research in Amsterdam. I talked to an asylum lawyer who's, he considered his main job to be training asylum seekers how to tell their stories in the Dutch way for Dutch asylum officers. And he said to me, you know who the hardest people are to train? And I said, who? And he said, Iranians, because Iranians don't start their story, at the beginning of the story, and they don't start at the beginning of their lives. They start at the beginning of the universe. And immediately I knew why this was. It's because ever since we're little children, we are taught the beginning of the universe rhyme. And the purpose of that, I guess, in Iranian storytelling is to put the story in context, to zoom out, to show the bigger world, and not, focus so much on one person's journey. Whereas in the West, we focus entirely on one person's journey. We have the hero's journey. And I think those different kinds of storytelling really shape how we think, whether we think someone is telling the truth or whether they seem to be shifty, or why are they going so far back, or why are they zooming so far in. And that's just one example of lots of different storytelling rules that decide whether or not we find that relatable. And not to mention the fact that we also, when we hear people talk about their pain, or any story really, we immediately try to relate it to one of our own stories from our own past, and that decides how we react to it. So I think the short answer to this is we look for familiarity. Familiarity is what causes us to believe people, and that's why we tend to believe people who are similar to us in all kinds of ways, because we can feel what they feel. I think on an individual level, we can work a lot harder to try to understand where our biases come from, where our kind of sense of credibility, what is believable, comes from. And we could fight our instincts and our biases by reading more widely, by, interacting with people across all kinds of, backgrounds and cultures, asking for their stories and working to believe them as we listen. I think reading is a big part of it, reading stories from around the world to our children and for ourselves, and to try to empathize in a different way, not necessarily by just looking for the most familiar connection to our own lives, but to try to completely leave our own lives and to enter that situation, I guess keeping only the part of us that is just human, and to try to relate to something that is very far from our own experience. I think that is something very radical and political, because it will train our mind to receive stories differently from around the world. I think on, kind of a more literally political plane, what we need to do is call for our systems not to be so based on individual biases. The asylum system, for example, is based on the individual judgment of asylum officers and Home Office presenting officers. And I think that those people should be trained about cultural storytelling, about storytelling when you have trauma, shame, fear, and they should really be retrained in their original purpose. Right now, I think asylum officers think of themselves as box tickers and people who are incentivized to send away as many as possible, gatekeepers. But really, their job was created because we agreed in the Refugee Convention to protect the world's vulnerable. And I think they need to be reminded of that humanitarian duty. I also think we need to remind, all kinds of different gatekeepers for our medical systems, like doctors, lawyers, people offering all kinds of social work and resources and help, to listen to stories of people that come from different places, with an open heart and with an understanding that those stories may be truthful and not feel necessarily familiar. So there's a lot of training that goes into that, an understanding of what our duty is to other people. And I think that's a very kind of long-term and difficult work that we all have to do together.